There's a moment in almost every relationship when emotional balance quietly changes. Not during an argument. Not during betrayal. Not even when someone leaves. It happens much earlier than that. Usually in silence. Usually unnoticed. Usually the exact moment one person begins caring slightly more than the other. And the terrifying part is how invisible it feels while it's happening. At first, it doesn't look dangerous. It looks like affection. Attention. Effort. You answer faster. You become more available. You start remembering tiny details they casually mentioned weeks ago. You prioritize them without thinking. And slowly, without realizing it, your emotional atmosphere starts revolving around their reactions. That's where power quietly begins shifting. Because the more emotionally necessary someone becomes, the more psychologically dangerous their absence feels. And people feel that shift long before it's spoken aloud. They notice when your mood changes from their silence. They notice when reassurance affects you too much. They notice when your attention becomes guaranteed. And something strange happens after that. The emotional tension changes. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Just subtly enough to feel confusing. Their replies become slightly shorter. The enthusiasm softens. Conversations begin depending more on you to stay alive. You start carrying emotional momentum that used to happen naturally. And most people don't notice the damage until much later. Because when you care too much, you stop observing clearly. You start interpreting distance as stress, coldness as exhaustion, disinterest as confusion. You begin protecting yourself from the realization you already feel coming. That's the part people rarely admit out loud. Sometimes the relationship doesn't collapse because love disappeared. Sometimes it collapses because one person slowly became emotionally certain the other would never leave. People stop chasing what feels guaranteed. And no one likes hearing that. Especially the person giving everything. Especially the person staying emotionally loyal. Especially the person rereading old conversations at 2 a.m. trying to figure out when the emotional atmosphere changed. Because it never changes all at once. It fades through tiny humiliations. Tiny emotional imbalances. Tiny moments your body notices before your mind accepts them. Like realizing they no longer react when you walk into the room. Or hearing them laugh harder with strangers than they laugh with you. Or noticing they stopped asking deeper questions. Conversations become updates instead of emotional experiences. How was your day? What did you eat? What time are you sleeping? The relationship keeps speaking, while emotional intimacy quietly dies underneath it. And the frightening part is how long people stay once they feel this happening. Not because they're happy. Because they're addicted to recovering what used to exist. That's what attachment quietly becomes sometimes. An emotional search party for a version of someone that no longer reacts to you the same way. You keep trying different versions of yourself hoping one of them brings the old attention back. You become softer. More patient. More understanding. Less confrontational. You suppress needs to avoid emotional distance. You pretend certain things don't hurt. You act emotionally detached while internally monitoring every shift in tone. And eventually, you stop behaving naturally entirely. You start speaking carefully instead of honestly. That's when people slowly stop recognizing themselves. The terrifying part about caring too much is how invisible self-betrayal feels while you're doing it. You think you're preserving connection. But slowly, you begin abandoning parts of yourself for emotional access. You tolerate inconsistency you once would have rejected. You lower standards for reassurance. You feel relieved over basic affection. A single enthusiastic message suddenly feels emotionally intoxicating because emotional consistency disappeared weeks ago. And your body notices that desperation before your pride does. That's why people become obsessed with tiny signals once emotional imbalance starts. A delayed reply. A dry response. A change in punctuation. Who viewed the story first? Who they suddenly seem more emotionally alive around. You notice everything. Because uncertainty creates fixation. And the more emotionally uncertain someone becomes, the more mentally consuming they often feel. That's why people stay awake rereading conversations they already memorized. Not searching for truth. Searching for emotional certainty. Searching for proof the connection still exists the way it used to. But attention changes before love admits it. Sometimes long before. You notice it in their eyes first. In their reactions. In how absent they feel even while physically present. You start talking while they scroll. You begin repeating yourself more often. Their curiosity fades before their presence does. And something deeply humiliating begins happening after that. You become emotionally grateful for effort that once happened naturally. A fast reply suddenly excites you. A compliment feels rare. Basic affection starts feeling earned instead of mutual. That's when emotional power has already shifted completely. Because the person caring less usually controls the emotional atmosphere without even trying. They decide response speed. They decide emotional intensity. They decide how much distance exists. Meanwhile, the other person quietly adapts themselves around that instability. And eventually the relationship becomes emotionally asymmetrical. One person experiences the connection casually. The other experiences it psychologically. That imbalance destroys people slowly. Not dramatically. Quietly. You still function. You still smile. You still go outside. But internally, your emotional state begins depending on unpredictable attention. And that dependency changes people. You become hyper-aware. Emotionally restless. You check your phone without notifications. You start sensing emotional distance before words confirm it. You notice when their energy sounds warmer around someone else. You notice when strangers receive curiosity you've been starving for. And nothing humiliates attachment faster than comparison. Especially when someone who once intensely noticed you begins reacting more intensely to other people. That realization changes something inside people. You start wondering whether you became emotionally ordinary. Whether they adapted to your presence. Whether emotional familiarity quietly erased fascination. And most people never say this out loud. But one of the deepest emotional fears isn't abandonment. It's becoming psychologically replaceable. Feeling your emotional impact fading while you're still there. Watching someone stop reacting to your presence in real time. That kind of silence changes people permanently. Because once someone realizes they're no longer emotionally affecting another person the same way, they either emotionally detach, or they start chasing harder. Most choose the second one. That's where emotional collapse usually begins. You start over-explaining, over-giving, over-analyzing. You become emotionally louder trying to revive emotional reactions that used to happen effortlessly. But attraction rarely returns through emotional pressure. If anything, too much emotional availability often accelerates the distance people fear most. Because emotional certainty changes perception. The moment someone fully stops fearing your absence, something subtle shifts psychologically. Not always love, but urgency, curiosity, attention. And people rarely notice they became emotionally predictable until the reactions disappear. That's why emotional withdrawal feels so powerful sometimes. Not because distance is healthy. Because absence restores observation. People notice what they no longer have access to. Presence becomes background noise when it feels permanent. Familiarity kills observation. And that realization destroys people once they experience it personally. Because suddenly every sacrifice feels invisible. Every effort feels emotionally unregistered. You realize you've been emotionally carrying the relationship alone for months. You realize conversations continue because you sustain them. You realize your absence no longer changes their emotional rhythm. That's one of the coldest realizations attachment can produce. Feeling emotionally optional to someone who once made you feel irreplaceable. And the worst part is how long people deny it. Because accepting emotional distance means accepting identity damage too. You begin questioning your attractiveness, your value, your emotional impact. You compare yourself to versions of you that once received effortless attention. You wonder what changed. But sometimes nothing externally changed. Sometimes emotional overavailability slowly removed tension the relationship was unconsciously feeding on. That's the dangerous part nobody wants to admit. People often appreciate emotional access more before it becomes unlimited. And once attention becomes emotionally guaranteed, people stop noticing its value the same way. Not intentionally. Just gradually. Quietly. Human attention adapts faster than loyalty expects it to. That's why some people only emotionally wake up once distance appears. Not because they suddenly love harder. Because certainty disappeared. And uncertainty sharpens emotional focus. That truth ruins people once they fully see it. Especially people who loved honestly. Especially people who stayed emotionally available believing consistency alone could preserve emotional intensity. Because eventually they notice something painful. The more emotionally careful they became, the less emotionally impactful they felt. The more they chased reassurance, the less natural reassurance became. The more they needed emotional certainty, the more emotionally powerless they felt without it. And eventually the relationship stops feeling emotionally safe. It starts feeling psychologically unstable. Every interaction affects your mood too deeply. Every silence feels loaded. Every delay feels personal. You stop experiencing connection peacefully. You experience it anxiously. That's when attachment quietly turns into emotional surveillance. You monitor energy shifts. You measure enthusiasm. You memorize emotional inconsistencies. And somewhere during all of this, you realize you haven't felt emotionally relaxed around them in a very long time. Only alert. Only hopeful. Only afraid. That realization is devastating because it exposes something people hate admitting. Sometimes people stay emotionally attached long after they stop feeling emotionally secure. Not because the connection still feels good. Because intermittent attention becomes addictive. The occasional warmth keeps reviving emotional hope just enough to prevent detachment. So people continue shrinking themselves emotionally trying to preserve moments that are already disappearing. And slowly, they lose emotional power completely. Not through weakness. Through overinvestment. Through caring so intensely that their emotional state becomes visible, predictable, and dependent. That dependency changes how people are perceived. Because emotional desperation is felt before it's spoken. People sense when they are your emotional center. People sense when losing them would psychologically destabilize you. And once that becomes obvious, the emotional balance rarely stays equal. That's why some people become colder the moment they realize how deeply you care. Not consciously. Not maliciously. But certainty changes behavior. People relax emotionally once they stop fearing loss. Meanwhile, the other person becomes more emotionally anxious trying to preserve connection. And eventually both people start living inside completely different emotional realities. One feels emotionally secure. The other feels emotionally endangered. That imbalance silently poisons everything. The conversations, the affection, the tension, the attraction. Even silence starts feeling unequal. One person rests peacefully. The other overthinks. And the terrifying part is how common this becomes. How many people slowly lose themselves trying to remain emotionally important to someone adapting to their presence more every day. You stop asking whether you're happy. You start asking whether they still care. That's when emotional power is already gone. Because the person who cares too much eventually stops feeling chosen. They start feeling tolerated. And there's nothing more psychologically lonely than sensing someone emotionally drifting while still holding your hand. Especially when they used to look at you differently. Especially when you remember exactly how emotionally intense they once were. That contrast destroys people. Not the loss itself. The comparison. The memory of how naturally loved you once felt before emotional certainty changed everything. And eventually, you stop missing the person. You start missing how intensely they used to notice you. That's the part people carry for years afterward. Not the relationship. The emotional disappearance. The slow realization that caring too much didn't deepen the connection. It quietly removed your power inside it. And most people don't notice that until they're already emotionally exhausted. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.